324 AD marks the specific point in the chronology of the ancient world where the tectonic plates of history shifted violently, triggered not by a massive earthquake or a cataclysmic volcanic eruption, but by a solitary object traveling across the desolate landscape of the Near East. A single scroll, tightly rolled and sealed with the imperial wax of the most dominant figure in the Mediterranean basin, were words composed by Constantine the Great, the man who had arguably achieved the most significant political and spiritual turnaround in Western history. These words were crafted with a heart full of hope and a mind flushed with the intoxication of divine favor, intended to be a vessel of mercy that would save lives and export the newfound peace of Rome to the distant East. But instead, they would function as a delayed fused weapon of mass destruction that would eventually sign the death warrants of 16,000 innocent men, women, and children. The Roman emperor had just done the impossible, ending 3 centuries of state-sponsored terror against Christians within his own borders, transforming the Roman Empire from a slaughterhouse where believers were fed to lions into a sanctuary where basilicas were rising from the earth and hymns were sung openly in the streets. It was a time of miraculous transition, a moment where the fear of the executioner's blade had been replaced by the favor of the imperial court. And naturally, Constantine, viewing himself as the 13th apostle and the chosen instrument of the Christian God, felt a moral imperative to share this good fortune with the rest of the known world. He penned a personal letter to his greatest rival, King Shapur II of the Sasanian Empire, the ruler of Persia, asking him to extend the same mercy and protection to the Christians living under his dominion, a request that seemed entirely reasonable to a Roman mind accustomed to the new era of tolerance. However, this letter would go down in the annals of time as the single most catastrophic piece of diplomatic correspondence ever written, a tragic misunderstanding that would curdle into a bloodbath. Within 15 years of its delivery, the Christian population of Persia would find themselves drowning in their own blood, their bishops forced to watch the systematic beheading of their entire clergy before facing their own execution, and entire communities wiped from the face of the earth.
In a purge so thorough that bodies were left to rot in the streets as grim warnings to any who dared to look west for salvation. This is not merely a story of ancient history, but a profound cautionary tale about the law of unintended consequences, a narrative that reveals how the road to hell is indeed paved with the best of intentions, and how political paranoia can turn neighbors into executioners and faith into a scarlet letter. To truly grasp the magnitude of this tragedy, we must peel back the layers of time and understand the world that birthed it, starting with the atmosphere in Rome before the miracle occurred. For nearly 300 years, to be a Christian in the Roman Empire was to live with a target on your back, a precarious existence where every shadow held a threat and every knock on the door could mean the end of your life. The Romans did not simply view Christianity as a nuisance, they despised it with a visceral intensity, seeing it as a cancer that threatened the Pax Deorum, the peace of the gods, which was the spiritual contract that kept the empire safe from barbarians and natural disasters. Because Christians refused to burn incense to Jupiter or acknowledge the divinity of the emperor, they were branded as atheists and traitors, accused of hideous crimes to justify their extermination, including cannibalism due to a misunderstanding of the Eucharist and incest due to their practice of calling one another brother and sister. This hatred manifested in waves of persecution that were sadistically creative, most notably under Nero in 64 AD, who used Christians as human torches to light his garden parties, their burning bodies providing the illumination for the Roman elite to sip wine and discuss philosophy while living human beings screamed in agony nearby. But even the horrors of Nero paled in comparison to the calculated industrial-scale efficiency of the great persecution launched by Diocletian in 303 AD, a systematic attempt to erase the name of Christ from history. Churches were leveled, scriptures were thrown into bonfires, and believers were stripped of all legal rights,
subjected to tortures that read like the fever dreams of a madman. Bishops were roasted alive on metal grids, their skin hissing as it fused with the hot iron, while others were scraped with pottery shards until their bones lay bare. And in one particularly harrowing account, 40 martyrs were forced to stand naked on a frozen pond in the dead of winter, with a warm bathhouse built nearby to tempt them into apostasy. A test of faith that resulted in 39 deaths and 1 tragic defection. For 8 long years the blood flowed freely, and it seemed that the darkness would never lift until the rise of Constantine changed the fabric of reality itself. In 306 AD, Constantine was merely one of several ambitious generals vying for the throne, but he possessed a vision that his rivals lacked. Before the decisive battle of the Milvian Bridge, historian Eusebius recounts that Constantine looked up at the midday sun and saw a cross of light emblazoned across the sky, with the Greek inscription En Teutonica, in this sign conquer. That night, Christ appeared to him in a dream, commanding him to paint the Chi Rho, the first 2 letters of Christ's name, on the shields of his soldiers, a radical order that forced his pagan legions to fight under the banner of a foreign god. The subsequent victory was absolute. Maxentius, his rival, was driven into the Tiber River, drowning along with thousands of his troops in a chaotic retreat that cleared the path for Constantine to enter Rome as the sole master of the West. He did not rush to the temple of Jupiter to offer sacrifices, as was tradition. Instead, he gave credit to the Christian god, initiating a revolution that would culminate in the Edict of Milan in 313 AD. This decree was more than just a legal document. It was a miracle that legalized Christianity, returned confiscated property, and allowed the faithful to walk in the sunlight for the first time in centuries. The psychological shift was seismic. Christians who had spent their lives hiding in catacombs were now invited to the imperial palace, their bishops given judicial authority and tax exemptions, and their God proclaimed as the protector of the empire. But amidst this jubilation, a dangerous blind spot developed. Constantine began to conflate the interests of the church with the interests of Rome, assuming that because Christianity was good for his empire, it would be welcomed everywhere. He forgot that 1,500 miles to the east, across the Euphrates River, lay the Sasanian Empire of Persia, a civilization that was the antithesis of Rome in almost every way. While Rome was a chaotic mosaic of cultures and gods held together by legions, Persia was an ancient, unified state built on the bedrock of Zoroastrianism, the world's oldest monotheistic religion, which viewed the universe as a dualistic battleground between Ahura Mazda, the god of light and order, and Angra Mainyu, the spirit of darkness and chaos. In the Persian worldview, fire was a sacred element, a manifestation of divine purity that had to be protected from pollution. And the guardians of this faith were the Magi, a powerful priesthood that served as the spiritual and political backbone of the state. These Magi were not merely temple attendants. They were kingmakers, advisors, and judges who viewed the infiltration of foreign ideas as a spiritual infection that weakened the cosmic strength of the empire. To them, Christianity was not a new revelation. It was a Roman export, a suspicious cult that had begun to spread into Persia through trade routes and refugees, establishing communities that were now linked by faith to the very enemy Persia had fought for centuries. On the throne of this vast Eastern Empire sat Shapur II, a monarch of such terrifying destiny that legend claims he was crowned in utero, the royal diadem placed upon his mother's pregnant belly to signify his sovereignty before he even drew his first breath. Shapur was a brilliant, ruthless, and paranoid ruler who would reign for 70 years, dedicating his life to restoring the glory of the Achaemenids and pushing back against Roman aggression. He knew that war with Rome was the natural state of affairs, a perpetual conflict over territory and trade. And suddenly, he was faced with a new variable, a Roman emperor who was not only aggressive, but evangelistic. When Constantine's letter arrived in the Persian capital of Ctesiphon around 324 AD, it was intended to be a gesture of goodwill, a bridge between East and West. In the letter, Constantine exuberantly declared his faith, boasting of how the Christian God had destroyed the tyrants who opposed him and granted him dominion over the West, effectively attributing his military superpower status to the favor of Jesus. He then pivoted to the subject of the Christians living in Persia, writing that he was delighted to hear that the fairest provinces of Persia were filled with such believers, and he urged Shapur to cherish them with your customary humanity and protect them with your usual benevolence. To Constantine, this was a gentle nudge, a way of saying, "Look, we are all brothers under God." But to Shapur II, reading this text in the context of high-stakes geopolitics, it sounded like a threat. Constantine was essentially claiming that the Christians in Persia belonged to him, that they were his spiritual subjects living in Shapur's territory, and that Shapur was accountable to Constantine for their treatment. It was an implicit claim of sovereignty, a declaration that the Roman emperor was the universal protector of all Christians, regardless of which side of the border they lived on. In the paranoid atmosphere of the Persian court, this was catastrophic. The Magi had long whispered that the Christians were a fifth column, a group of double agents who refused to worship the sun or fire, and whose loyalties lay with the Christian Caesar rather than the Zoroastrian King of Kings. Constantine's letter confirmed every conspiracy theory the Magi had ever spun. He had inadvertently painted a target on the back of every Christian in the Sasanian Empire, transforming them from a tolerated minority into a perceived security threat. For 15 years, the letter sat like an unexploded bomb in the royal archives. Shapur was too busy securing his eastern borders and dealing with internal strife to act on it immediately, but the suspicion festered. Then, in 337 AD, the fuse was finally lit. Constantine died, leaving the Roman Empire to his 3 sons, who immediately began posturing for war. The peace fractured, and the legions began to amass on the frontier. Shapur II, sensing an opportunity to reclaim lost territory, prepared for a massive offensive. But war requires gold, and the Persian treasury was strained. In 340 AD, looking for revenue and a way to test the loyalty of his subjects, Shapur issued a decree imposing a crippling double tax on all Christians in his empire, explicitly stating that this revenue would fund the war against Rome.
He ordered Simeon bar Sabbae, the bishop of Ctesiphon and the Catholicos of the Church of the East, to collect this tax from his flock. It was a devilish trap. If Simeon collected the tax, he would be funding a war against his fellow Christians and acknowledging that the church was a servant of the state. If he refused, he would prove that Christians were indeed traitors who favored Rome over Persia. Simeon, a man of ironclad integrity, refused. He told the king's messengers, "I am a shepherd of souls, not a tax collector," and pleaded that his people were poor artisans and farmers who could not bear such a burden. Shapur's response was swift and brutal. He arrested Simeon and charged him with treason, declaring, "Simeon wants to make his disciples rebel against my kingdom and become servants of Caesar, their fellow believer." The trap had snapped shut. The king ordered Simeon and 100 of his senior clergy, bishops, priests, and deacons to be dragged to the winter palace at Karka de Laydan. There, Shapur offered Simeon a final chance to save himself and his people, worship the sun, the symbol of Persian divinity, and renounce the god of Rome. Simeon refused, bowing to the king as a ruler, but refusing to bow to the sun as a god. Enraged, Shapur ordered the execution of the 100 priests, but with a sadistic twist designed to break the bishop's spirit. Simeon was forced to watch as his friends and colleagues were beheaded, one by one. Imagine the horror of standing there, the smell of blood filling the air, knowing that a single word from your lips could stop the slaughter, yet knowing that that word would be a betrayal of everything you believed. Simeon did not break. Instead, he stood by the executioner's block, encouraging each man as his turn came, reciting scripture and promising them that they would soon be in a kingdom where there was no pain or persecution. He blessed them as they died, acting as their shepherd until the very end. On Good Friday of 341 AD, a date chosen deliberately to mock the Christian commemoration of the crucifixion, Simeon himself was beheaded, the last to die. His death marked the beginning of what historians call the Great Slaughter, a 40-year period of systematic extermination that would claim the lives of at least 16,000 documented,
though the true number is likely much higher. This was not a chaotic riot. It was a state-sponsored genocide carried out with bureaucratic precision. The Magi compiled lists of known Christians, and military units were dispatched to villages and cities to enforce the king's will. The pattern was consistent: target the leadership first. Bishops were hunted down, arrested, and tortured in ways that defy imagination. The accounts of the martyrs from this period are some of the most gruesome in history. Christians were tied to the legs of elephants and crushed to death. Others had their skin slowly flayed from their bodies while they were still alive. Some were tied to bent palm trees that were held down by ropes. When the ropes were cut, the trees snapped back upright, tearing the victims in half. The cruelty was performative, designed to terrify the population into submission. Ordinary believers faced a stark choice: convert to Zoroastrianism or die. Many fled to the mountains or the deserts, becoming refugees in their own land. The Magi reserved a special burning hatred for those who had converted from Zoroastrianism to Christianity, viewing them as apostates who had betrayed their blood and their culture. These converts were hunted with relentless zeal, often denied burial so that their bodies would be scavenged by wild dogs and vultures, a final desecration in a culture that valued the purity of the elements. The persecution ebbed and flowed with the tides of war. Whenever the Roman legions scored a victory on the frontier, the persecution in Persia intensified, as the Christians were blamed for the success of their co-religionists in the West. It was a vicious cycle where the geopolitical struggle between two empires was written on the bodies of the innocent. By the time the violence began to subside in the 380s after the death of Shapur II, the Church of the East lay in ruins. Its hierarchy had been decimated, its churches burned, and its survivors traumatized. Those who remained learned a painful lesson. To survive in the East, they had to sever all ties with the West. The Church of the East began to emphasize its distinct Persian identity, distancing itself from the theology and politics of Rome.
They adopted the Syriac language exclusively, developed their own distinct theological traditions, and went out of their way to prove their loyalty to the Persian king, eventually finding a way to coexist. This separation would have profound long-term consequences, leading the Church of the East to expand eastward along the Silk Road, taking the gospel to India, Central Asia, and eventually China by the 7th century, forever distinct from the Roman Catholic and Orthodox traditions of the West. But the cost of this survival was a river of blood. The most disturbing aspect of this entire tragedy is the realization that Constantine never knew what he had done. He died in 337 AD, comfortable in his bed, believing that he had ushered in a golden age for Christianity. He never saw the reports of the massacres, never heard the screams of the martyrs in Ctesiphon, never knew that his charitable letter had been the spark that ignited the inferno. He died with a clear conscience, while thousands of miles away, his spiritual brothers and sisters were being slaughtered because of his words. This story serves as a haunting reminder of the complexity of history and the danger of good intentions. Constantine was not evil, he was naive. He assumed that his reality, a world where Christianity and power were aligned, was the only reality. He failed to empathize with Shapur's perspective, failed to see how a paranoid king in a hostile security environment would interpret an intervention from a rival emperor. He didn't understand that in the ancient world, religion was not a private matter of the heart, it was a public matter of allegiance. To be a Christian in Persia after Constantine was to be seen as a Roman agent, regardless of one's actual loyalty. Shapur II, for his part, was not a cartoon villain, but a rational actor operating within the brutal logic of his time. He saw a threat to his state, a minority group with transnational ties to an enemy power, and he took steps to neutralize it. From a purely strategic perspective, his actions made sense to him, which makes the tragedy even more chilling. It wasn't madness that killed these 16,000 people. It was cold, calculated political strategy fueled by a misunderstanding. This is a pattern that echoes through history, repeating itself in every century where transnational identities clash with national security. We see it in the religious wars of Europe, in the internment camps of the 20th century, and in the sectarian conflicts of the modern world. Whenever a group is perceived as having loyalties that transcend borders, they become vulnerable to the suspicion of the state. The Great Slaughter of Persia is a 1700-year-old warning that empathy without intelligence is dangerous, that diplomatic words have consequences, and that the powerful often remain blind to the suffering they cause. It challenges us to look beyond the simple narratives of good versus evil and understand the structural forces that drive human conflict. It forces us to ask, how often do we, in our desire to help, inadvertently make things worse? How often do we project our own values onto other cultures without understanding their context? The bones of the martyrs in Persia are a silent testament to these questions. They remind us that history is not just a collection of dates and battles, but a graveyard of the innocent, victims of the grand games played by emperors and kings who move populations like pawns on a chessboard. As we reflect on this forgotten chapter of history, let it not be just an academic exercise, but a call to deeper understanding. The past is not dead. It is living in the structures of our world, in the way nations interact, and in the way we perceive the other. By remembering the Great Slaughter, we honor the victims who were erased from the history books, and we arm ourselves with the knowledge to, perhaps, just perhaps, recognize the warning signs before the next tragedy unfolds. The story of Constantine's letter and Shapur's sword is a stark illustration that the road to catastrophe is often built with the bricks of righteousness, and that the most dangerous weapon in the world is sometimes a pen in the hand of a leader who thinks he is saving the world. This is the burden of history, to remember the mistakes of the past so that we might tremble at the power of our own choices today. We must learn to see the world through the eyes of our rivals, to understand the fears that drive their actions, and to realize that our truth is not always universal. Only then can we hope to break the cycle of violence that has plagued humanity since the beginning of time. The 16,000 ghosts of Persia are watching, waiting for us to learn the lesson they died to teach us, that faith and power are a volatile mix, and that true wisdom lies not in the assertion of dominance, but in the humble consideration of consequences. Stay curious, stay critical, and never stop digging for the truth that lie buried beneath the sands of time.